why wine lovers should check out tequila and tequila lovers should check out wine, right here on the Tequila Hombre, coming up next. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Tequila Hombre, where today we're going to explore tequila and wine and just how close these two are to each other. They're actually very, very similar, and people that enjoy wine should enjoy tequila, and while people that enjoy tequila should enjoy wine. Let's not waste any more time, though. Let's get into it. We're going to get techie. We're going to get dive down deep, so grab your pen and paper and your learning ears, and let's get it going. All right, first of all, the connection between wine and tequila and mezcal and agave spirits is very, very close. A lot of people know this, but actually tequila, before it was actually called tequila, was called vino de mezcal de tequila, which means wine of the mezcal from tequila. So when they produced an agave spirit, it was typically a vino de mezcal de Pueblo or wherever it was from in Mexico, but it was called a vino de mezcal, a wine of mezcal from whatever region it was in. And then once they protected the name tequila and set up the designation of origin on it and the denomination and stuff, then it was just called tequila for short. But originally it was called a vino or vino de mezcal de tequila. So a wine of mezcal de tequila. And why was it called this? Well, let's dive a little deeper down into how similar wine is from tequila. All right, so let's take things down to like the very, very base level of everything here to kind of talk about the similarities between them. So we're going to talk about the fermentable sugars now. A lot of people think that because you're a whiskey drinker, you should look more into tequila and stuff, when actually it favors more of the wine drinker. And let's talk about that and how how the sugars are composed, okay? So when you take a grain and you mash a grain, you're converting the starches there into sugars that are called maltoses, okay? And maltose typically consists of 2 molecules of glucose in them. So it's basically all glucose. Where when you're dealing with grapes is a mixture of glucose and fructose. Now, when a grape is not ripe, it's typically mostly glucose. But once a grape starts ripening more, the fructose level increases in the grape. And so it actually makes it sweeter, because fructose is a sweeter sugar than glucose is. So after the more riper a grape gets, the more fructose is created and less glucose. Where when you look at agave spirits, when the conversion happens, changing the starches into sugars, it produces mostly fructose. So it is a fructose fermentation that you're working on when fermenting the mosto from an agave nectar. So, and that's similar amongst all the different agaves as well. So you're basically looking at a composition of about 80% fructose and 20% glucose on the mosto that goes in for fermentation for tequila. So that ties wine and tequila more closer as far as the sugars related in fermentation, where they both have a composition of fructose and glucose, but the different levels of each are different depending on the varietal of grape, how ripe it is, as well as the variety of agave species that you're using and how ripe it is as well. Now, because that grapes and agave both are more fructose-based fermentations, it adds another level of fermentation things that they have to worry about that you won't have to worry about when doing a grain-based fermentation. And one of those is malolactic fermentation. Because of the fact that they're more fructose-based sugars, malolactic fermentation is more inclined to happen with grape fermentation and agave fermentation than it is with grain-based. And so when a malolactic fermentation starts happening, it turns more into a bacterial fermentation, and it incorporate more of a buttery cheesy kind of note to it, depending on how far into malolactic fermentation they go. Now with wines, they have a tendency of liking to use malolactic fermentation. With tequila, they typically try to end the fermentation before it goes into malolactic, but we're finding more and more distilleries are experimenting with malolactic fermentations to add more complexity to their agave spirits. Now, one interesting note to look at as well is a lot of you know that about Cascanes and the malolactic fermentation they did on the Joven. Well, the winemaker, or the winemaker, actually the tequila maker that makes Cascanes, Colin Edwards, is also a winemaker. And so he incorporated some of the stuff he's learned from winemaking into tequila making and makes one of the better tequilas on the market today as far as flavor profiles go. So there's a connection there between winemaking and tequila making as well. All right, so a second thing that wine and agave spirits have in common is what is called terroir. Now, terroir is a French term that simply means a sense of a place. So what that means is that, like with grapes, you can get a sense from where the grape is grown and what kind of conditions it was put up to based on how it tastes. That's called terroir. It's the same with agave spirits as well, with tequila as well as other agave spirits. Depending on where the agave are grown, you can get a sense of where they were grown from them as well, and the flavor profile. So that's why we talk about Los Altos agave from the islands versus agave from the Valle, the lowlands. And then when you look at mezcals as well as other destillados de agave, you look at what state the agave were grown in. So you can have an espadín that was grown in Michoacán versus an espadín that was grown in Oaxaca, and have two different flavor profiles because of where they were grown and what kind of conditions and soils and stuff that they were subjected to. It's the same with wine. You have a wine that was grape that was grown in, say, Sonoma County versus one that was grown in northern San Diego. You're going to be able to taste the differences from those two wines based on where the grapes were grown and what kind of conditions they were subject to. For example, the other day I was at a winery in Temecula, California, tasting a Pinot Noir, and it had a completely different flavor profile since the Pinot Noir grapes were actually grown in the La Cresta area of Southern California versus the Sonoma County area, where their Pinot Noirs have a completely different flavor profile, which is what people are more used to when drinking a Pinot Noir. Well, that kind of same thing happens with agave spirits and tequila based on where the tequila is grown. If it's grown in Los Altos, it typically has a sweeter, more fruitier flavor profile. When it's grown down in the Valle, they typically have to be more mineral and floral notes that show up. I mean, there's changes. You'll find exceptions to the rules, but that's where you can basically pick out how terroir affects the agave. Now, Ocho Tequila in itself is an experiment in terroir, where depending on what year you have of their plata, you can taste how the agave from the different fields, which are at different altitudes in different areas, affect the flavor profile. So how terroir affects the agave. So that's why they put the date on the bottom of an Ocho bottle with the field that it was grown, so you can actually taste how one field at a certain altitude that receives a certain amount of water, a certain amount of sunlight what is in a certain kind of soil is different from another field, which is in a different area, which is different temperate zone, which has a different composition of their soil. And you can taste how the agave are affected by the terroir. So it's another interesting thing that wine and agave spirits have in common is terroir. All right, so now we're going to talk about something else that wine and agave spirits have in common, and it's varietals. As you know, with wine, you can have many different types of varietals of wine that you can get into, whether it's white wines, red wines. You can get into Chardonnays, you can get into Syrahs, you can get into Pinot Noirs, Merlots, Cabernets, and they're all basically different types of grapes that they use to create these different varietals. Well, the same exact thing is true with agave spirits and tequila. So tequila is made from one particular varietal of agave spirits, and that is the Weber Blue Agave. So people all the time ask me, what's the difference between a mezcal and tequila? They're the same thing. They're basically the same thing. It's just tequila focuses on one varietal of agave, where if you dive into mezcals, you can get into other varietals of agave that you can experiment with. And those could be like a Tobala, a Jabali, Tepestate, among like 30 to 40 other different types of agave that they could use to make mezcals, or even like Bacanoras and other Destilado de Agaves. So if you really want to explore different varietals, so let's say you don't like tequila, you may like a different varietal of agave spirit used in a mezcal. So a lot of people too associate mezcals being extra smoky, and because they picked up a cheap bottle in a grocery store, but that's not true. And it's kind of the similar thing with wine, where you may try a Syrah and say Syrah may not be for me, but you may try a Cabernet Sauvignon that you go, wow, this is more up my alley. This is what I like. Or you could try a Chardonnay and say I like Chardonnays, but I don't like Cabernets, and so it's the same type of thing with agave spirits. Keep your mind open and experiment and journey out and try different agave spirits and find the ones that you like, the one that fits your flavor profile. So don't be afraid of mezcals too, because then that's really kind of diving into the wine world, where there's so many different varietals that you could try that have such different flavor profiles from each other that you may find something that you go, wow, I really like this. This is one of my favorites. So I always encourage people, just because you try one and don't like it doesn't mean you shouldn't try another varietal, and explore and see what's available out there. All right, so let's talk about another similarity between wine and agave spirits like tequila or mezcal. Their processes are very, very, very close on how both of them are made. So let's dive into that a little further, and we're going to start first with cooking. In wine production, there is no cooking to convert the starches to sugars. It is done naturally on the vine. And so this is one of the big differences in the production of tequila versus wine in creating the fermentables, is that when an agave is pulled out of the ground, it's a starch ball and it needs to be converted to sugar. And they do that by cooking the agave. So the agave is either cooked using an autoclave or a brick oven, where they use an industrial boiler to create steam to power the autoclave or the brick oven to cook the agave. Or they can be done in earthen pits for mezcals, or ancestral tequilas, where they use the fire as your source of heat. So they use wood as your fuel versus using an industrial boiler and steam. So that may incorporate a little bit of a smokier flavor to it, but if it's done right, you won't even taste the smoke on the cook there. So that's one of the main differences, is that the starches need to be converted to sugars with agave, where in grapes, it's done through nature, but the longer the grape stays on the vine, the more of the glucose is converted to fructose, which is a sweeter sugar, which creates a sweeter, riper grape. So after you have your cooked agave and your ripe grapes, the processes are very, very similar. The first thing you need to do with grapes to make wine is you need to crush your grapes. So they typically do that by people stomping on it, which I'm sure you've heard, or they use a grape press to extract the sugars and stuff from the grapes. Where agave fibers, they use a roller mill or a taona to crush the grape and to crush the fibers to get the sugars and stuff out of the agave fibers, so that they can create the mosto, which is your fermentable sugars. So they're both done using crushing, although with wine production, they do what's called maceration, where they'll soak them in water to get the skins loose, because the skins can contain some tannins, where they don't have to worry about that with agave fibers. They basically run water in there and run it through a roller mill or through a taona and try to extract as much sugars out of the fibers of the agave as possible. But they both require crushing in the second stage to get the fermentable sugars out and ready for fermentation. So then the next process after crushing and getting the sugars ready for fermentation is actual fermentation, which fermentation can happen with wines in wooden tanks. It happens in as well as in stainless steel tanks. Same with tequila and agave spirits. It is a mostly fructose based fermentable sugar in them. There's the variances in the varietals changes with wine, where certain varietals will have more glucose, less fructose, and some will have a higher level of glucose than others and less fructose. And so those will change depending on the varietal, where typically with agave spirits, it's pretty much right around the same of an 80% fructose versus 20% glucose composition when it goes into fermentation. But because it does have the fructose element in it, malolactic fermentation is something that will happen in both of them. And it has to be monitored depending on how much malolactic accents you want to your either agave spirit or your wine. So after fermentation's done, then things change a little bit too for the two, since tequila is a spirit, it is distilled, where wine, there's no distillation unless they're going to make a brandy or a cognac out of it. But typically that's where wine is then placed into barrels and getting ready and prepared to be aged to make whatever wine that they're looking to make with whatever flavor profile, where tequila can be served white as a blanco without any aging, but then also it can be placed in barrels just like wine, French oak or American oak or Hungarian oak, and aged into a reposado, an extra añejo, or whatever kind of expression that they wish to create with their spirit. All right, there you go. There's some very big similarities between agave spirits like tequila and mezcals and wine production. And we're going to explore this a little further on my new channel, the Hombre Cave, where we're also going to start talking about wines on there as well. I'm going to have a guest winemaker that'll be joining us on the channel, where we'll talk about tequila and agave spirits and production and wine and how he produces wine. It's going to be really great information, really interesting. So make sure you head on over to the Hombre Cave channel and subscribe so you don't miss more of this interesting content. And hopefully if you're a wine drinker that's watching this and really enjoy exploring wines, that maybe this will open your mind up to exploring tequila a little bit deeper and further, as well as agave spirits, instead of letting that bad experience you had in college not allow you to taste some of the amazing things that are offered in a tequila and agave spirit. Well, like I always say, life is too short to drink bad tequila or agave spirits. So keep watching my videos, keep listening to my recommendations, and you'll be in great shape. And we're going to check out wines now on the Hombre Cave channel. So make sure you join us there and learn about wines and tequila as well. Salud.